How about the possibility of paying $30 per gallon in tax for gasoline? If you think that you've been a little bit disappointed by paying an extra dollar a gallon for gas just over the past year, roughly, well, you've hardly seen anything yet. The fact is that if the climate alarmists get their way, we will be seeing gasoline prices that are incredibly much higher than that, all in the name of fighting global warming or climate change. Welcome to tonight's edition of From the Stacks, a live stream podcast. Pardon me, a live stream program of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. I'm Cal Beisner, the president, founder, and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance, and we exist to educate the public and policymakers on economic development for the very poor, biblical earth stewardship, and the gospel of Jesus Christ with the worldview, the theology, and the ethics that come along with that. My scheduled guest for this evening, Benjamin Zycher of the American Enterprise Institute, called in sick yesterday, and I wasn't able to line up anybody to take his place. So this is going to be a sort of an experiment tonight. I am going to present to you a PowerPoint program that he was going to present, and we'll see how it goes. Anything brilliant in this tonight, chalk it up to Ben Zycher. Anything that's a problem, chalk it up to yours truly. Before I get into that, though, I wanted to mention that through the month of February, and we just have a week left of that, a little less than a week actually, 6 days, we are glad to give free as our thanks when you make a 100% tax deductible donation to the Cornwall Alliance of literally any amount, a copy of this 350-some page book, Clean Energy Exploitations, helping citizens understand the environmental and humanity abuses that support clean energy. That's clean in scare quotes because it really isn't clean. The cover of this book sort of says it all. You have an armed soldier standing guard over children and others mining for cobalt in a mine in the Republic of the Congo in Africa. And this just presages what you're going to learn in the pages of this really stunning book, all about the various different ways in which providing the minerals, including rare earth minerals, necessary to construct wind turbines and solar panels, the energy sources to which climate alarmists want us to switch away from fossil fuels, is involved in a wide variety of really dreadful abuses of human people, human beings, our fellow human beings. This is a tremendous book, and to request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you reach the comments field, write in promo code 22-02, that's promo code 22-02, or the book's title, Clean Energy Exploitations. And we'll be glad to send you a free copy of this book. Well, now, I was going to have, as I mentioned a bit ago, Benjamin Zycher of the American Enterprise Institute as my guest tonight. He's ill, not able to do that. And so to give you basically what he and I would have been discussing tonight, I'm going to try to present to you with possible technical difficulties in the process, a PowerPoint presentation that he did and that would have been the basis of his own remarks in our interview. This is actually from a PDF rather than a PowerPoint, which makes it a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me through what could be a slightly clumsy manipulation of the computer here. But we're going to switch over now to his PDF, and that will get us started here. And you should now be seeing. There we go. You should now, in a moment, be seeing something different. Let's see. This is not working properly. Yeah. I am seeing a not responding message. This is not good news. This worked when my producer Jim Moline and I were testing it out before we went online here, before we went live. But for some reason now I've just got the wonderful circle spinning around and around that Windows gives you, as if that were somehow or other helpful to you. And in the upper left, I can see not responding. So we're going to have to see what we can do about getting us back to work here. All right, now my producer suggests that he goes ahead and starts it up, and I tell him when to change pages. So let's try that. Jim, I need you to go to the very start, to page 1 of the PDF, the PowerPoint, and let's see what I can see here. This is still not working because my error message is covering over the center of my screen. I'm going to suggest to my producer that we log off and log back in and start over. It's a shame. All right, we'll see what we can do. I am actually logging off for a moment and coming back in. Don't go away. We believe that we can get this going. Okay, I am back, and let's see if this time we're able to make this toggle work. We should be able to share the screen here, and right now you should now be seeing Notes on Climate Science and Policy from October 2021 by Benjamin Zycher, Senior Fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. Okay, now this is a PDF, so there is no such thing as presentation mode. So we're just going to have to go with seeing it this way. But I'll just try to walk us through this, and I'll make comments of my own based on what I see from Ben Zycher. So we have first a list of topics to be addressed. And I'm just going to run down this list. There are some basics of climatology. Is anthropogenic climate change real? We'll be looking at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, its its climate models and its greenhouse gas scenarios. At the issue of equilibrium climate sensitivity, natural versus anthropogenic climate change, evidence of a climate crisis, is there any? The benefit cost analysis of greenhouse gas emissions policies, and then additional topics, the crude politics of greenhouse gas policy proposals, greenhouse gas policy ideology, anti-human, totalitarian, observations on miscellaneous malarkey, many potential low probability catastrophes. Is climate special? Is it all downside? Benefits of a warmer Earth, the interests of future generations, and a bit about apocalyptic environmentalism as a religious movement, and then finally a conclusion, adaptation over time as the only sensible approach. So we begin with some climatology basics. Atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases absorb some heat that otherwise would escape into space. Now, this radiative forcing, as it's referred to, results in rising temperatures in the troposphere and at the surface. Atmospheric carbon dioxide in 1850 was about 285 parts per million of the atmosphere. I would say that that's probably with a rounding error of around 20 parts per million. It's really difficult for us to know for sure what it was at that time. By 1960, it had climbed to 317 parts per million, and by 2020 to about 414 parts per million. It's up around perhaps 416 parts per million by today. By itself, this increase in greenhouse gas concentrations has a very small effect. Most of the empirical evidence indicates that if you were to completely double the amount of greenhouse gas that we have in the atmosphere from 1850, that would take us up to 570 parts per million from the 285 that we started with. If you were to double, that would result in about a 1 degree Celsius increase in global average temperature. What brings about catastrophic predictions is the notion that feedback effects are going to amplify that warming. So that really means that the feedback effects are far and away the most important question in our climatology, in our science of climate change. Feedback effects include evaporation of water from the ocean, forming water vapor, cloud formation, precipitation, effect on winds as temperatures around the globe change, and various other feedbacks. The fact is that we really know very, very little about feedbacks. They're extremely difficult for us to understand, difficult for us to measure, partly because they change very, very rapidly all over the world, all the time, and partly because the climate system is what's called a coupled nonlinear chaotic system. And therefore, according to the UN IPCC, it is literally impossible, mathematically impossible, for us to predict future climate states. That's what the IPCC said in its third assessment report in 2001. It has never backed off from that statement. And the result is that what they say is that the best we can do is to provide ideas of the likelihood of this or that state, future climate state, and compare those likelihoods. Well, that gets to be a pretty subjective experience, as the reading of the reports from the IPCC will show. Additional climatology basics. First of all, the feedbacks are very, very complex. No one understands them all. And our understanding just of cloud formation and the resulting climate effects is very poor. The ocean evaporation feedback is particularly important because water vapor is by far the most important greenhouse gas in terms of the radiative properties of the troposphere. Roughly 2/3 of the total radiative effect comes from just water vapor by itself. Now, clouds, which form from water vapor, make up the majority of the remaining third. And so that leaves only about 1/6 to be attributed to the combination of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, and other greenhouse gases. So water vapor is extremely important, and frankly, we don't understand very much about it. My good friend, Dr. Roy Spencer of the University of Alabama, an award-winning NASA climate scientist, once said, we really don't know clouds at all. Third page of basics of climatology. We really should ignore the notion of settled science when it comes to climate change. The net effects of the forcings and feedbacks are the subject of intense scientific debate. Notice what I just read there. The net effects of forcings and feedbacks are the subject of intense scientific debate. What that means is we really don't know, and this is highly debated among climate scientists, whether the net effect of forcings and feedbacks is positive, meaning it increases the warming from a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, or negative, it decreases the warming from a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. If that's in doubt, if that is fiercely debated among scientists, and it is, then it is impossible to say that the science is settled that human-induced global warming is going to be catastrophic, even dangerous, even net harmful. It could very easily be net beneficial. It could be extremely beneficial. The science is not settled on those questions. Our estimates of the so-called equilibrium sensitivity of the climate system to changes in atmospheric concentrations of GHG evolve constantly. Climate sensitivity is shorthand for how much global average surface temperature would increase from a doubling of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere after all the various different climate system feedbacks had been accounted for. That's equilibrium sensitivity, and the estimates of that evolve all the time. As greenhouse gas concentrations rise, additional emissions have smaller and smaller radiative effects. That is, as concentrations rise, the greenhouse gas molecules increasingly interfere with each other in terms of heat absorption. This is because greenhouse gas molecules absorb heat in only certain in only certain bands of the radiative spectrum. And the result of that is that, for example, if water vapor has absorbed all of the radiation in a particular band, then there's nothing left over for added CO2 to absorb. This is discussed in what's called saturation of radiative bands. As greenhouse gases get more and more dense in the atmosphere, more and more concentrated, there's less and less of that radiative band to be absorbed by the next batch of GHG added to the atmosphere. It's kind of like painting a window white. If you have a glass window and you paint it white, you're going to block an enormous amount of light from the sun, but a little bit of light is still going to get through. If you paint another coat of white over that, you'll block most of the rest of the sunlight that's coming through, but not quite all of it. And what you block this time isn't anywhere near as much as you blocked the first time. Paint a third coat, well, you'll block a little more, but there wasn't much left to be blocked, and therefore you just really don't have any additional darkness to be achieved by that, or in the case of greenhouse gases, you don't have any additional warming to achieve once you've reached certain concentrations. So here's a bit of basic climate science. Increasing greenhouse gas concentrations should yield slight cooling in the lower stratosphere. the stratosphere, of course, being very high in the atmosphere. The reason for that is rather simple. If you're keeping more heat down in the lower atmosphere, that leaves less heat available to move up into the upper atmosphere. So this is illustrated in this graph from the University of Alabama at Huntsville, showing the global average temperature variations for 4 different atmospheric layers: the lower troposphere, the mid-troposphere, the tropopause, and then the lower stratosphere. And you notice that from January of 1979 to March of 2015, we had warming in the lower troposphere and the mid-troposphere, and we had slight cooling in the tropopause, and then much more significant cooling in the lower stratosphere. So that's what happens as we add greenhouse gases. Now, the question, is anthropogenic climate change real? Some people will want to debate this. Most climate models predict that increasing concentrations of greenhouse gas will yield warming at higher latitudes relative to tropical regions, greater warming in the northern hemisphere relative to the southern hemisphere, and most surface and tropospheric warming in the coldest, driest air masses, Siberia and Western North America, taking place in the winter, not in the summer. Another way to put this is that, according to the models, greenhouse warming happens primarily toward the poles, primarily in the winter, and primarily at night, meaning that it raises very low temperatures and it doesn't have much effect on high temperatures. So the result is that you reduce the number and severity of severe cold periods, of cold snaps, and you don't significantly increase the number or the severity of heat waves. That's particularly important because cold snaps, on average, kill about 20 times as many people per day as do heat waves. So just in terms of that measure, we actually see a significant benefit to human health and well-being. The surface data, not models, but the surface data, which are pretty messy because surface measuring stations for temperature are not randomly placed around the world. They cover a very tiny proportion of the globe's surface. They tend to be far more frequently on land than over water, and they also tend to be concentrated in urban and suburban areas, not in rural areas. The surface data, the weather balloon data, that is the radiosonde data, and the satellite data are consistent with these predictions. Now, there have been 6 generations of climate models so far, and we're going to look just a bit at the 5th and 6th generations in terms of their modeling of the tropical mid-troposphere. Now, this is a very important part of the atmosphere to model because according to the climate models, this should be a sort of a bellwether, a canary in the mine of climate change driven by greenhouse gases. Every climate model says that increasing greenhouse gas concentrations should create an enhanced heating effect in the middle troposphere, that is about 39,000 feet over the tropics. Now, the tropics, for the most part, are water. If you add some greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, slight warming leads to additional ocean evaporation. And as that water vapor rises into the mid-troposphere, it condenses, releasing the heat that kept it in vapor form. So that should, according to all the models, lead to more heating in the middle troposphere than in other parts of the atmosphere. It's straightforward science. The problem is that the average prediction from the 6th generation, that's CMIP 6, that's Coupled Model Intercomparison Project 6 models, the average prediction given the greenhouse gas data is that we should have been seeing in the mid-troposphere, tropical mid-troposphere, warming of 0.4 of a degree Celsius per decade. That is part of the so-called scientific consensus. But the satellite record says that mid-tropospheric warming for 1979 to 2019 was only about 0.13 to 0.17 degree Celsius per decade. The difference between those, 0.04 of a degree, is actually much larger than the standard deviation of the temperature data. That means that the temperature data are simply very, very messy, and we really cannot confirm the model predictions from them. The weather balloon and reanalysis, compensating for various biases, give the same data, the same results, again, very messy. So that the models cannot predict accurately what's happening in the tropical mid-troposphere suggests a very serious problem with our basic understanding of atmospheric physics. Now, here we're going to see compared for you the 5th generation models versus the data. And again, this is for the tropical mid-troposphere. The model trend average says that we should see 0.44 of a degree Celsius per decade. The observed trend average for the 5th generation models was 0.16 of a degree Celsius per decade. So that's well under half, almost just a third of the modeled expected warming. That indicates that the models are badly mistaken. The 6th generation models, compared with the data, are shown in this graph. And here, the model mean trend calls for 0.40 of a degree Celsius per decade of warming, whereas the actual observed mean trend, shown in the green arrow there, is, again, 0.16 of a degree Celsius per decade. So that 6th generation models are slightly better in that regard than the 5th generation models, but not much better by any means. And this is important because, as the Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman pointed out, when you have a hypothesis or a theory as to how something in the world works, you test it by making predictions based on that theory. If the theory is right, what should we see in the real world? And then you compare those predictions with observations. And if the observations contradict or don't agree with the predictions, then your hypothesis is wrong. And it doesn't matter how brilliant you are, how beautiful your hypothesis is, or how many people agree with you. If the observations contradict the predictions, then your hypothesis is wrong. Well, what all this means is that, of course, the models simply do not provide for us any rational ground for any prediction of future global average surface temperature. And if they don't provide rational ground for that, then they also don't provide any rational ground for any policy to deal with it. So from the 5th to the 6th generation, we've spent tens of millions of dollars over a period of 7 or so years, untold thousands of man hours, and yet the 6th generation models are hardly better than the 5th. How can that be? Well, the mainstream climate science establishment fundamentally believes that its models are correct and the data are wrong. Now, that is, in my thinking, just an absolute reversal of scientific method. In science, we look at the data and we correct our predictions and we correct our hypotheses by the data. Well, why can't models predict the past accurately? Now, we know reasonably well, there are error bars in our knowledge, but we know basically what past temperatures have been like. And so models can be set up to retrodict, to predict backward. And yet they don't do it well. they don't do it well at all without some extreme ad hoc adjustments, parameterizations of certain figures in the models. Well, the most likely reason why the models can't predict the past is that the model assumptions don't allow enough heat to escape to space. That is, they don't allow for negative feedback, or as much negative feedback as actually occurs when warming events because of rising GHG concentrations occur. And this probably is related to the assumed distribution of clouds or water vapor. Remember, no one understands the effect of clouds. Clouds both trap heat and reflect it back into space, but we have no idea at this point how much they do either one of those. So the flow of energy is likely to be incorrect in the models. Now, the models also are built to reflect certain scenarios for future greenhouse gases. That is, what are their concentrations going to be in the future? And the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, uses 4 different scenarios, representative concentration pathways. These are assumed concentrations of the various different greenhouse gases off into the future. The numbers in these RCPs are theoretical calculations of radiative forcing effects in watts per square meter. Now, this is all way too small to measure directly. The average effective solar radiation at the Earth's surface is only 240 watts per square meter, and the changes involved in that are well under 1%. So we certainly can't measure it directly. We have to try to model it. Now, in the 6th assessment report from the IPCC, the scientific basis volume of which was released last summer, RCP 8.5 is called a low probability scenario. That's this one particular scenario for future concentrations. And yet, almost all of the horror stories in AR6, the 6th assessment report, are generated by the models assuming RCP 8.5. So in other words, they take the low probability scenario, they plug that into the models, and then the models yield a catastrophic apparent warming. Well, this is just not at all realistic. It's not good science. Here are some year 2100 details of the 4 different RCPs, representative concentration pathways. For greenhouse gas concentration, RCP 2.6 calls for greenhouse gas concentration to arise to only 490 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. 4.5, RCP 4.5, calls for it to come to 650 parts per million. RCP 6.0 calls for it to reach 850, and 8.5 calls for it to reach 1,370. Now, are those realistic? Are any of those realistic? Well, the average increase annually from 2018 to 2100 is expected to be 1.1 part per million of CO2 equivalent concentration in RCP 2.6, 3.0 in RCP 4.5, 5.5 in 6.0, and 11.9 in 8.5. But, and now we'll look also at the resulting temperature anomalies. For RCP 2.6, it's just 1.5 degrees. Now, by the way, that is not 1.5 degrees from the present to 2800 or from 2018 to 2100. That is 1.5 degrees above the so-called pre-industrial global average surface temperature. We're already most of the way there. We've risen by about 1 degree. And so the question is, how much more are we going to go? Will we go to 1.5, or According to RCP 4.5, will we go to 2.4 degrees above pre-industrial? Or according to 6.0, will we go to 3 degrees above pre-industrial? Or according to 8.5, will we go to 4.9 degrees? Well, let's look at a little history. The average annual greenhouse gas increase in parts per million from 1959 to 2019 was 1.6 parts per million per year. From 1985 to 2019, it was 1.9 parts per million per year. The single largest, and the average increase from 2000 to 2019 was 2.2 parts per million per year. Now, this is the actual past. The single largest annual increase in parts per million was 3.5 in 2016, and the second largest, 3.4 in 2016, and the second largest was 3.0, and that was in 1998. So the question is, are these representative concentration pathways, these RCPs, are they projecting realistic increases in carbon dioxide equivalent concentration in the atmosphere? And the answer is they most certainly are not. Particularly 8.5 is grossly exaggerated. The assumed annual average increase in global GHG concentrations is about 6 times greater than the average since 1985, 3.5 times the single biggest increase in the data set. Also, RCP 8.5, in order to get those figures, assumes that coal is going to become the biggest global energy source after 2050 and will remain so through 2300, even though nations all over the world are working to cut back their consumption of coal for energy. Whether that's a wise thing or not is another question. Further, the 2050 CO2 emissions in RCP 8.5 are more than double the International Energy Agency baseline emissions scenario. And the Electric Power Research Institute, back in 2014, predicted that cumulative carbon dioxide emissions after 2100 would exceed total global fossil fuel reserves, according to RCP 8.5. Well, you can't do that because it's from burning fossil fuels that most of our CO2 comes. If you've run out of global fossil fuel reserves, you cannot continue to put more CO2 into the atmosphere. So 8.5 is utterly unrealistic. RCP 8.5, though, remains the American federal government's business as usual scenario. That's despite the fact that the IPCC called it a low probability scenario. In particular, in the National Climate Assessment, which is released every 4 years, and in the various agency analyses of proposed regulations and similar measures, RCP 8.5 remains the business as usual scenario. It is the one central source of the horror stories, and it is, in fact, impossible, literally impossible. And yet, over and over, we're told, but science, follow the science. Well, how about equilibrium climate sensitivity? This is another of the major issues. The temperature effect of a doubling of GHG concentrations after the climate system adjusts fully is what's referred to as ECS, or equilibrium climate sensitivity. The second crucial assumption driving predictions of future climate phenomena in the context of increasing GHG concentrations is this very concept of equilibrium climate sensitivity, or ECS. Well, IPCC fifth assessment report predicted, or rather estimated ECS as between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius with a median of 3. The sixth assessment report says that it's going to be between 2.5 and 4.0 degrees Celsius. That is, it raised the lower end by half a degree, but it lowered the upper end by half a degree. And it came up with a median of 3.25, which is mathematically necessary. And yet the preliminary drafts of the sixth assessment report suggested ECS of 2.5 to 5.6 degrees C. And on the basis of those drafts, media around the world predicted disaster to come. And yet, the estimates reported in the peer-reviewed literature published during the last decade instead find ECS between 1.8 degrees C and 2.4 degrees Celsius, with a median of 2.1 degrees C. Those measures are not expected to be dangerous. So you have to go with high ECS, and you have to go with a very low probability emissions scenario in order to get the catastrophic predictions. Now, this is a graph from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of global land and ocean temperature anomalies since 1880. Notice, very important to define what anomalies are. These are not raw temperatures. These are departures from the mean from 1900 to 2000, the century-long mean. So these are departures from that. Pre-1940, most of the departures were below that mean. Post-1940, most of the departures are above that mean. Now notice that these departures, the low ones, the cooler ones, are in blue. The warmer ones are in red. Notice also that this looks, on this graph, like pretty significant change in temperature. And yet remember, it's not temperature, it's anomaly that's being measured here. And look over at the left axis there. We go from 0.6 degrees Celsius, minus 0.6, up to plus 1.0. So in other words, we have a total span of just 1.4 degrees Celsius graphed here for us. Now, let's take a look at a different way of viewing this, the same data, or approximately the same data for a slightly different time period. I'm going to take you to some graphs that I prepared, again, using NOAA's own data. And let's see if this will work well as I switch over here. All right, now you see this looks essentially the same. I did it a few years ago, so it isn't quite as recent. Oh, that's right. That's right. I have to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And to do that takes a couple of steps. There. And now I should be back in front of you. And now I've got to toggle over again and get into the correct screen, the correct window. And here we have, yes, this should do it. There we go. All right, now this is essentially the same, except that it ends a few years earlier, but it's the same data source, the same numbers as used in the previous graph that you saw from NOAA. Now let's see what happens if we just take away the colors and see what that does for us psychologically. Here, same numbers, very same numbers, but just represented by a blue line. Psychologically, is that as scary as the other one was? Well, I don't think so. Now, let's see what happens if we plot these numbers not on a y-axis, left axis of 1.6 degrees Celsius, but of a y-axis that better represents typical change in temperature on any given day at most locations between nighttime low and daytime high. That's what you get. This is a 20-degree y-axis. Now, there are plenty of places where you have a lot more than 20 degrees difference between nighttime low and daytime high, but let's just assume that for the moment. Now, even more striking, I mean, by the way, this doesn't look nearly so scary, does it? You're looking at a change between about a little under 15 degrees Celsius global average surface temperature and right about 16 degrees Celsius global average surface temperature. Doesn't look so scary, does it? Now, let's plot this on a y-axis that shows us the whole range from 0 degrees Kelvin, all the way up to about the hottest temperature ever measured on Earth's surface. Now, that thick blue line that you see there that doesn't seem to change at all, that's what we wind up with. The reason I'm sharing this with you is just to give you some indication of the psychological effect achieved by what I would consider to be a dishonest, a misleading way of presenting data visually. All right, now I'm going to have to switch back over to the other presentation by Mr. Zycher, and that'll take just a moment here, but then we'll be ready to move, ready to go. And there we go. We're back to Benjamin Zycher's presentation. You see that he's accepted. He's been willing to use the NOAA's way of putting this. I think it's helpful just to see what happens if we do a little tweaking. All right, now, something that we notice from this is that from 1910 to 1945, we had a temperature increase of about 0.75 of a degree, about 3/4 of a degree Celsius. Now, this cannot have been the result of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, because they only increased from about 300 parts per million to 310 parts per million over that period. So that temperature increase had to have been natural, and no climate model predicts it. The mainstream climate scientists cannot explain it. Well, if that temperature increase was natural, how do we know that subsequent temperature increases were not partially natural as well? The usual assumption is that every change is anthropogenic. That is deeply dubious. Indeed, I would say it comes pretty close to being outright dishonest. A quick comment here. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change specifically define the term climate change, as they're going to use it, as human-induced, anthropogenic climate change. So if you're asked to find the causes of climate change, and climate change is defined as man-made climate change, what kinds of causes are you going to look for? Man-made ones or natural ones, or both? No, you're only going to look for man-made ones because that's the definition provided by the agency under which you work. So it shouldn't be any surprise to anybody that they find no natural causes, only human causes. That's not honest. Now, here is the University of Alabama, at Huntsville, satellite global average temperature record, and it shows an increase of 0.17 degrees Celsius over the mean for the 1991 to 2020 period, and it shows the running centered 13-month average. Now, this shows annual hot days since 1895 per station. You notice that most of the highest numbers of hot days occurred in the late 1920s through the late 1930s, and again in the mid 1950s, but especially the 1930s. And the number of annual hot days, temperature above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or above, pardon me, daily maximum temperature above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. For the darker red, the 105, for the lighter red, 100 degrees. There are no significant trends, but 11 of the 12 hottest years occurred before 1960. That comes from John Christie at the University of Alabama at Huntsville. The U.S. Climate Reference Network under NOAA says that the 137 meticulously maintained weather stations across the United States from 2005 to 2021 showed no observable trend in average temperature. Ice core reconstructions from the past million years of temperatures show no particular long-term trend, and you can see where we are currently, and there have clearly been warmer periods in the past. Clearly, people were not driving SUVs and burning fossil fuels 100 million years ago, or during any of the previous periods of significant warming. Sea levels were rising for thousands of years before the present, and in fact, the rate of rise in the recent present has been much, much slower than it was in the period of roughly 18,000 to 8,000 years ago. So apparently our man-made climate change is not causing dangerous increase in sea level rise. Satellite record beginning in 1992 shows sea levels rising at 3.3 millimeters per year. That's 13 inches per century. Is that a crisis? Has sea level rise accelerated? Well, the earlier tidal gauge record said about 1.9 millimeters per year, but the two data sets are not comparable. We don't have satellite record before 1992, and we cannot simply paste it onto the tidal gauge record. Tidal gauges measure the elevation difference between the sea surface and a point on land supposedly fixed. But in fact, land is not fixed. Land can settle, land can rise due to seismic activity, to the withdrawal of underground water and various other causes. A warming Earth should create an acceleration in sea level rise from ice melt and thermal expansion of seawater. But is all of this natural or anthropogenic? Natural or man-made? Frankly, nobody knows. Then there's Arctic sea ice. That's downward in some significant ways. I would love to get the raw data for this and provide a y-axis that would be more realistic than this one, that would show the whole potential change from 0 to whatever was the highest. But this one shows significant loss in Arctic sea ice. But what's happening at the other end of the planet? Well, Antarctic sea ice, according to data from NOAA, has actually risen compared with the 1981 to 2010 average, and there are other studies that show the same. How about tropical cyclones? Are we getting more of them? Are they more powerful? Many people think that climate change, global warming, would cause more powerful and more frequent tropical cyclones, hurricanes. The answer is no. There is a very slight downward trend in the accumulated cyclone energy annually from hurricanes, and there's no trend for tropical storms, sub-hurricane force tropical storms. Take a look at major tropical cyclones. That's major hurricanes above 96 knots. There is no trend in those, and there's also no trend in the 64 to 90 knot hurricanes. And here again is accumulated cyclone energy. No trend here. How about US wildfires, 1985 to 2020? How many of them? Actually, this is 1985 to 2020. There doesn't appear to be a significant trend other than slightly downward. The Palmer, and by the way, I will back up to that for a moment. If we were to go back from the NIWC, National Interagency Wildfire Center, by the way, pardon me. If we were to go back to 1900, we would see an enormous decline in both the number and the total acreage burned of wildfires, running from 1900 through about 1950. And then we've been largely flat since then. About the Palmer Drought Severity Index, how much drought are we having? Well, there's not much in the way of any trend there either, although people predict that because of global warming, we should see more droughts and more intense droughts. US flooding over the last century, we've actually seen a decline. Food production. People say, oh, global warming is going to reduce the production of food in the world because the heat will harm crops. Well, as a matter of fact, global food production is very significantly upward. You can see the particular line for world there. That's the third one up from the bottom. But we've seen a significant increase in food production. The decrease in food production in Northern America is not, by the way, because of any weather problems. It's because we've diverted a whole lot of our agricultural land from growing food to growing corn for ethanol to add to our gasoline. Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gives us a lot of horror stories. It calls for the collapse of Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. This is the so-called thermohaline circulation. The IPCC says that's very unlikely, and it says that it has high confidence that it's very unlikely. So that's one horror story that the IPCC itself refutes. Another horror story, we'll see a collapse of the ice sheet on Greenhouse or on Antarctica. Again, IPCC says exceptionally unlikely, and it says we have high confidence that it's exceptionally unlikely. How about huge carbon release from permafrost thawing? It says possible, but we only have low confidence in that. Well, how about clathrate methane release? This is from methane clathrates on the bottom of the sea as ocean temperatures rise, which is, by the way, an aside there. The mass of the ocean is hundreds of times greater than the mass of the atmosphere. So it takes far more energy to achieve a 1/10 of a degree increase in ocean than in the atmosphere. So we're certainly not going to see any significant increase in the temperature at the bottom of the ocean. But some people mistakenly think, oh, well, maybe we will, and then the clathrates will begin to release their methane. The IPCC says very unlikely, and it has high confidence that that is the case. Here's some more scare stories that the IPCC itself refutes. People think the tropical forests are going to die, and that gets rid of the lungs of the earth, so to speak. Well, the IPCC says low confidence in these projections. Boreal forests will die. No, low confidence. Summer Arctic sea ice will disappear. Likely medium confidence. Long-term droughts, low confidence. Monsoonal circulation collapse, low confidence. So these scare stories just don't stick, even according to the IPCC. Now, how about climate effects of climate policies? If we adopt various policies, how much would they change global average temperature in the future? Mr. Zycher used the EPA climate model to run this. The ECS, equilibrium climate sensitivity assumption, was 4.5 degrees. That's at the upper end. So we're being generous here. Biden's net zero policy, if it were achieved, would reduce global average surface temperature in the year 2100 by 1700ths of a degree Celsius. All right, 173 thousandths of a degree. Big difference. We can't measure that. The Paris Agreement, if all the countries in the world were to abide by that, and frankly, their nationally determined contributions are deeply unserious. There's no enforcement mechanism. Most of this is just wishful thinking. But suppose that it were, in fact, entirely implemented. Well, it would reduce global average temperature in the year 2100 by about 178 thousandths of a degree Celsius, 1700ths of a degree, less than 2/10ths of a degree. Suppose that China managed a 50% cut in its GHG output. Well, maybe we would see a 0.184 degrees Celsius reduction. Suppose that globally we had a 75% cut in GHG emissions from now to the end of the century. Well, we would cut global average temperature by about 0.5 degree Celsius. These effects would be barely detectable given the standard deviation of the land-ocean temperature record of about 0.11 degree Celsius. They would certainly have no impact on any ecosystem or on any human well-being. What would these things cost? Are any of these policies actually plausible? Well, according to the IPCC's forecasts or scenarios, predictions, if we had the RCP 8.5 or 8.6 scenario, global GDP would fall 3.5% in 2020. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. No, global GDP did fall 3.5% in 2020 due to the COVID economic downturn. Greenhouse gas emissions fell by 6.4%. Mr. Zycher's conservative estimate of the cost of only part of the electricity portion of the Green New Deal is $500 billion per year. That's $500 billion per year. Is there a benefit cost test that would justify these policies, that would pass a laugh test? No, we don't think so. What would be the future economic effects of anthropogenic climate change? Well, according to the most commonly used model, this is a coupled climate and economics model, the maximum global GDP effect of 3% in 2100. That is a hypothetical loss from 2100 GDP. But that GDP is expected to be quite a few times higher than the current GDP. So in other words, people would be 3% less better off than they otherwise would be, but they'd still be quite a few times better off. The IPCC, in its most alarmist report, calling for 1.5 degrees, says that unmitigated climate change would reduce global domestic product in 2100 by 2.6%. And yet, per capita GDP would still be about 400% higher, about 4 times what it is now. So in other words, climate change is not going to do significant harm economically. We will still be many times better off than we are now. Now, the politics of GHG politics can be, or policies rather, can be pretty crude. The GHG policies are intended to increase the cost of conventional energy from fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. Now, the electricity part of trying to achieve net zero under the Biden plan, Zycher estimates that the annual per household state-by-state costs would range from a low of $230 in Vermont to a high of $17,150 in Wyoming. That's per household per year. The 10 lowest states would all be Democratic, except one, Idaho, and the 10 highest states would all be Republican. One wonders whether there is a pattern there. The obvious goals are to force red states to pay blue states for credits, and that makes red states less competitive by raising costs in their energy consumption and production sectors relative to blue states. Quick aside here, if you would like to post any questions for me to try to handle before we finish the program tonight, and I think we're about 10 minutes away from there, please feel free to do that on Facebook. We're able to monitor those, our producer can, and he'll bring them to my attention. Now, here are some ideological dimensions. First of all, if fossil fuels are evil, so are all the activities that increase the demand for fossil fuels. Well, what are some of those activities? Education, training, healthcare. All sorts of investments in human capital require more energy, and fossil fuels are the best source of that energy. How about climate policy? Climate policy is an effort to increase the cost of energy. No other outcome is possible from policies designed to reduce climate change. Yet, what does that mean? It means less energy for education, training, healthcare, all these other investments in human capital. Higher energy costs mean greater poverty. There's a simple correlation between growth in energy consumption and the poverty rate. As energy consumption rises, poverty falls. And climate policy, in other words, the policy to fight climate change, is fundamentally anti-human. Now, some other ideological dimensions. The so-called smart grid requires smart meters that government can use to track individual power use and to control thermostats by the minute. Is that what you want for your home? How about if your home includes a senior citizen who has difficulty maintaining body temperature because of illness or simple age? Whether staying warm enough or staying cool enough. The all renewable power system cannot be reliable even in theory. Intermittency and needed gigahertz frequency synchronization of generation units is impossible with wind and solar. And we get farther and farther away from that possibility the more wind and solar that we pour into the grid. So, greenhouse gas emission restriction policies inexorably lead to power rationing driven by political criteria, not by individual needs. A third batch of ideological dimensions. Ever-tightening electric vehicle mandates will make personal and business transportation much more difficult and costly. And that's particularly going to be a problem in rural and agricultural regions where people need to drive greater distances, where farmers need power for huge, very, very heavy agricultural equipment that cannot be provided by batteries. Over time, there's an inexorable household and business shift away from rural, exurban, suburban regions toward urban centers. Is that what we all want? And we would make massive numbers of people ever more dependent upon government. If ever there is invented an electric vehicle that serves consumer preferences efficiently, the left will oppose it. Well, kind of wrapping up here. Miscellaneous malarkey. 1. The notion of carbon pollution. This is a term that's used by the left, by the climate alarmists, to scare people, because when you hear about carbon pollution, you tend to think about black soot, about particle pollution that is dusty, that is nasty, that in fact can be very harmful to health. But carbon pollution is one thing. Carbon dioxide emissions are another thing entirely. Carbon dioxide is not soot. It is not solid. It is an odorless, colorless, non-toxic gas that is absolutely essential to life. The more of it we have in the atmosphere, the better plants grow. And the better plants grow, the more food there is for everyone, especially the poor. We hear about renewable electricity as clean and competitive. No, wind and solar are saddled with toxic metal pollution, wildlife destruction, noise and flicker effects, massive land use. One Harvard study released last summer indicated that we would have to cover essentially all the land from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi with wind turbines if we were to generate all the electricity that we now use in America just from wind. And if we were then to electrify our entire vehicle fleet, cars, trucks, trains, etc., we would need to have so much more electricity that we'd have to cover the rest of the land from the Mississippi to the Pacific coast with wind turbines. In addition, we have increased emissions of pollutants, including some greenhouse gases, as natural gas backup units have to be cycled on and off to back up for the times when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. There are subsidies, guaranteed market shares, backup costs, transmission costs, etc., that go along with so-called renewable electricity. I'll make a quick mention here, which I will once more before the show ends, of the book that we're offering as our way of saying thanks when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation to the Cornwall Alliance, a book called Clean Energy Exploitations, a wonderful revelation of these various things that I've just been talking about here. Electric vehicles are involved in toxic metal pollution, toxic leakage in landfills, and so on. Recycling their batteries is essentially impossible under present technology, and yet they are filled with toxic metals. For the environmental left, unconventional energy and electric vehicles are clean, but they are so only if we ignore the environmental problems that they create. There's also what's called the broken window fallacy, destruction of the economic value of the energy consuming and producing capital stock will increase economic growth and green employment, we are told by the left. No, no, no. Is a destructive hurricane bullish for the market? The simple correlation between energy consumption and growth and GDP growth is very positive, 0.7. And there's also a positive correlation between energy consumption and employment, 0.6. So green jobs actually are a cost, not a benefit of government policies. And we're told that 97% of scientists agree. Well, how did 97% of the abstracts that took a position morph into 97% of the scientists? The fact is that the 97% figure is mythical. What they do agree is that global warming is real and human activity probably does contribute to it, maybe significantly, probably significantly. But there's no agreement about it being dangerous, no agreement about it being catastrophic, no agreement about the necessity of spending trillions of dollars to try to counteract it. And we're also told we need to conserve. Well, market forces do not yield consumption of all known reserves during the current time period. That is, the market is conserving. Nothing conserves better than a market because a market responds to prices. And as something becomes more scarce, its price rises, and the market therefore either provides more of it or uses less of it? What is the basis for the implicit premise that the market itself is not conserving enough, so we need government policy to conserve more? There is a value judgment being made there along political lines. It is not something driven by either science or economics. How about the idea of sustainability? Does there exist a coherent definition of that term? Well, the usual response is that natural resources are finite and thus eventually will be depleted. But that's a fundamental error. If a resource is being depleted, the expected future price will skyrocket, and that will provide incentives to sell less today, that is, to conserve, in favor of sales tomorrow. Well, why was the global oil supply not used up decades ago? At any given moment, the expected price of a depletable resource rises at the market rate of interest. And let me move now toward conclusion. Is climate special? Well, there are many plausible low probability catastrophes outside of climate: mass contagion, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes, large asteroid strikes, bioterrorism, nuclear war, etc. Now, we're being asked to spend 2 to 3% or more of GDP on fighting climate change. Should we spend 2 to 3% or more of GDP on those? To the extent that anthropogenic climate change proves to be a problem, at least it will emerge slowly, whereas any of those can be quite sudden. Last point, CO2 fertilization or greening of the earth. This is a model, an illustration put together by NASA. The change in global leaf area, 1982 to 2015. The green areas show where global leaf area has increased. The yellow and red and purple areas show where it has decreased. Obviously, it's increasing in far more places than it's decreasing. Why is that? Because we're adding more CO2 to the atmosphere, and that is a 100% good thing. There are other benefits of warming: increased agricultural productivity, increased water use efficiency by plants, reduced human mortality. With virtual certainty, there will be future glaciation. That is, a new ice age will come. How long will it be? Well, anthropogenic warming might delay that somewhat. Think about the interests of future generations. Think about a child born in a cave 50,000 years ago with life expectancy at birth of perhaps 10 years, perhaps 20. That child wants improved environmental quality and better food, water, housing, medical care, etc., to live longer than 10 years. So future generations, that child would want us to bequeath to it the most valuable possible capital stock. Or future generations want us, to bequeath to them the most valuable possible capital stock. Environmental quality is one important dimension among many, and that requires efficient resource allocation by the current generation. Apocalyptic environmentalism has essentially become a religious movement. The pagans of the environmental left and their golden idols, the revised book of Genesis and the celebration of economic and physical suffering rather than the celebration of human thriving and prosperity. Here's a bit of wisdom from Dogbert. Try ramming your SUV into hybrid cars. That should stop them from using fuel altogether. You can't save the earth unless you're willing to make other people sacrifice. I'm in. Why one sacrifice instead of another? Adaptation over time, not mitigation of climate change, is the only sensible policy. That is, instead of trying to reduce global warming, we should be preparing ourselves to adapt to whatever temperature the future brings to us. And we know that we can do that because, frankly, human beings can thrive in any climate, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. And the wealthier they are, the better they can do in any climate. So there are massive uncertainties about the notion of catastrophic global warming. There is no evidence of a crisis, and there is deep and inevitable politicization of climate policy. And yet, who rejects the notion that we should increase our ability to adapt over time? But that increase requires economic growth. You've been looking at and hearing me comment on a PowerPoint presentation by Benjamin Zycher, who's a senior fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. And you can contact him directly with questions at benjamin.zycher@aei.org. And you can read about him at aei.org/scholar/Benjamin-Zycher. And that brings me to the end of this part of the program. We are ready to come back to your seeing me. But we're about done here. And do we have any Facebook comments? Yeah. Yes, Tracy Ware Elam says, sadly, much of this miscellaneous malarkey should be common sense, but the left is too delusional to accept it. Yeah, I'll go with you there, Tracy. And it's sad because I think that we could, in fact, see much better thinking about these things if we had a better education system, if we had honest media, and frankly, if we had honest politicians as well. Do we have any other Facebook comments or questions? That's it. All right, well, thank you again for joining me. Quick reminder here, through the end of February, as our way of saying thank you, when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size, no matter how large or small, we'll be glad to send you a copy of Clean Energy Exploitations, Helping Citizens Understand the Environmental and Humanity Abuses that Support So-Called Clean Energy. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the Donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in promo code 22-02 or the title Clean Energy Exploitations, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. Thank you for your patience as we dealt with the technical problems early on in the program. I hope that you have a wonderful week and that you come back to be with us again next week on From the Stacks.